All right, hello, welcome everyone. My name is Jordan Howell. I'm the co-director of the Rowan Center for Responsible Leadership and also associate professor of business here at Rowan University. Excuse me, today we are very excited to welcome Dr. Janelle Knox-Hayes to talk to us about all sorts of different aspects of economics, finance, climate, social impact, resilience, all these wonderful topics that her research has touched on over the years. If you're not familiar with Dr. Knox-Hayes already, Janelle Knox-Hayes is the Lister Brothers Associate Professor of Economic Geography and Planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She also holds a visiting research fellowship at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University. Her research focuses on the ways in which social and environmental systems are governed under changing temporal and spatial scales as a consequence of globalization. She has studied the political and economic interface of financial markets and environmental systems and how individuals and organizations plan and make decisions under conditions of socio-economic uncertainty. Her latest project examines how social values shape sustainable development. Janelle has been the recipient of an SSRC Abe Fellowship for the study of environmental finance in the Asia Pacific region and a Fulbright Fellowship for study of sustainable decision making in Iceland. She is the author of a number of peer-reviewed works in prestigious journals and presses. She also serves as an editor of the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy, and Society. Dr. Knox-Hayes earned a BA in International Affairs, Ecology, and Japanese Language and Civilization from the University of Colorado Boulder, and an MSc and DPhil from the University of Oxford. Dr. Knox-Hayes has also worked as an energy analyst for both the United States Government Accountability Office and for a firm called New Energy Finance. So with that, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Knox-Hayes. Audience, please post your comments and questions in the chat area. And then Janelle, if you want to address them mid-talk, you certainly can. We can save them to the end. I'm happy to moderate whatever works best for you. But please, audience, do post your questions and comments there. And with that, over to you, Dr. Janelle Knox-Hayes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jordan, and for the opportunity to present. So I'm going to focus the talk today on climate change, assessing the value of sustainable economies. So related to work on understanding and pricing greenhouse gas emissions, but I think delving beyond that into thinking about how do we see climate change as a catalyst for widespread change, and what kinds of principles might guide that kind of transformation. So, and again, I'm happy also midway to be interrupted. If anyone has a burning question, I'll try to keep a little bit of an eye on the chat. So some of this work is drawn from my 2016 book, The Cultures of Markets, The Political Economy of Climate Governance. And this was an international study of emissions markets, thinking about markets as institutions and how those are adapted into different political economies. So it had multiple scales, varied socio-political and cultural contexts, and focused the case studies on the EU, the USA, Australia, China, Japan, and South Korea. Drawing from 2015, the Paris Accord, there was a real transformation in the way in which political economies think about the responses to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And this was sort of a movement from what had started in Kyoto with a top-down approach of having binding commitments by designated Annex 1 countries to an approach where all parties, there's no longer really common but differentiated responsibility, but rather all parties have a bottom-up approach and they make their own pledges, their own intended nationally determined contributions, and those are periodically reviewed. The last update was meant to take place in 2020, of course, was delayed to this year because of the COVID pandemic. So I think there's still some strong movement on the international scene towards agreements, some exciting agreements out of Glasgow this year about limiting production with coal, a number of countries committed to transforming their transport sectors into completely renewable resources. So some exciting developments, but then also some criticism that we didn't have the same presence from major players like China and India and commitments as we should have had, and a sort of lag of countries to actually meet the intended nationally determined contributions that they make. And then also there was a real hope for a big breakthrough on Article 6, which is the article around pricing emissions. And there's still a delay on negotiating the core principles of that. So sort of what replaces on the international stage the clean development mechanism. But I think beyond that, there seems to be this growing, maybe post-political consensus that carbon pricing is the way in which we will address at least the mitigation side of climate change. This isn't the most up-to-date information, but there's a really nice State and Trends carbon pricing report from the World Bank Group, which every year tracks the development of carbon pricing. And so now I think it's actually 60 national and more than 30 subnational jurisdictions that are putting a price on carbon in a variety of forms, either with taxes or with some kind of cap and trade system. I think they're also tracking cap and dividend systems that are being established. And then, some questions around the viability of these different approaches, because many of these markets are still in a pilot phase or they're still in trial phase. I think there's actually, if we take the ecologically relevant standard of $40 per ton as the kind of required standard at which the carbon price has an impact, there's still, I think, only 5 countries that meet that standard. So there's definitely momentum around carbon pricing and generating a response to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but a lot of criticism about whether or not the approaches are strenuous enough. So this is a kind of something that I explore in my work, is this idea that climate change is just about the failure to price externalities. Externalities are environmental benefits or costs, usually considered in the form of costs accrued from economic activities that are not accounted in economic transactions. So we think about carbon pollution as a great example, forestry degradation, the loss of pollinators. Positive externalities, seafood production, timber, pollination, water filtration, flood bank attenuation. And the idea behind carbon markets, it's a rather abstract connotation, but is probably tracing its origins to Coase's theory of social cost. And then from there, its implementation from actors such as Richard Sander, who built many of the first climate exchanges in the United States and Europe, is this idea that it's not just one externality. If you can successfully manage an externality with this mechanism, with a pricing mechanism, a market system, you can do this for virtually every externality. And this has long been an interest, at least within the finance and market side of carbon emissions trading, because think about the scale. If it's no longer just about pricing economies based on what they actually produce. And to some extent, I argue, financial services is about potential productivity, but it's really capturing an entirely new domain of the productive economy, and that is the alternates, the ramifications or external ramifications of economic decisions with plus and negative, positive and negative connotations. So I think this is ultimately, as abstract as carbon pricing is, this is for this century where the real interest is. Can we actually manage the productivity of the biosphere through market mechanisms? And what my 2016 book was discovering or studying was the way in which the market makers across different sectors. So I interviewed more than 250 market actors in these jurisdictions, usually regulators, financial service industry leaders, those building and operating the exchanges, those working within utilities and related sectors, to understand how they understood and why they were developing the markets. And then I coded this data is specifically coming from 2 questions, which was what are the opportunities and challenges of pricing greenhouse gas emissions? And then what are the drawbacks and the consequences? And asked this question of all of those that were interviewed, and then coded their responses. And I identified basic 7 advantages and opportunities that most participants related their response to, and then 6 disadvantages and challenges, and some consistency. You could see these as sort of parallel or related, but also some variation. So the idea of governance efficiency markets are just a more efficient means of creating a governance system, the efficacy of a carbon price, that there is a true value that is captured in the carbon price and that transmits through different jurisdictions. Flexibility, that a market system is just more flexible. And here people usually made a difference with taxation, even though it's really, the pricing, it's from an economic standpoint, it's more or less the same thing, controlling quantity or controlling cost. And then political viability, again, usually in comparison to taxation, but this idea that the market, the way in which authority is governed under a market, it feels less like a penalty and more like an opportunity to use one's skill and have their own self-determination over outcomes. And this, interestingly, it wasn't just in the Western and US, Australia, EU cases, it's also in the Asian cases, which is really interesting, even in China, which is, of course, a one party system, a real sense that there is a need for political viability. And then technology investment and innovation, this idea that the market creates a pathway, usually through diverting funds into technology, research and development, that then leads to innovation. And that's actually one of the things I later in the book challenge, is that idea that the pathway is a direct source of finance to innovation. The ability for global scale. Here, there was a lot of interest with the size of the market. A lot of the traders as early as 2006 and 2007 in New York were saying, well, as soon as there's federal regulation, this is $1 trillion market. It's bigger than virtually every energy market. So the sense that as soon as it achieves scale and liquidity, it automatically has impact. And then finally, the capacity to reduce emissions. And interestingly, only 5% of respondents made this direct connection. So the market actually reduced emissions. And so that whether or not that's explicit or implicit, that connection wasn't necessarily in the minds of participants. And then on the disadvantages, reliance on governance cohesion, again, that's seen as something, the political viability is a strength, but the sense that you have to govern these markets. And if you have jurisdictions that are constantly changing political perspective through electoral cycles, there's no stability for those markets. Challenge of political uncertainty, again, something very similar, this idea that without a political guidance, you don't have, no, I'm sorry, I'm reversing these two. So challenge of political uncertainty was about the political viability. The reliance on governance cohesion was this idea that to be effective or achieve that international scale, the governing systems had to match. So the European market needs to look like the Australian market, needs to look like the Chinese market. And then for a lot of the Asian cases, in particular, technical complexity, this idea that to make the markets operate effectively, there's an incredible amount of technical complexity, because as they were building their markets in China and Japan and Korea, they were learning from the mistakes of the European Union and realizing this takes a lot of, the next point, time to translate. And then finally, prevalence of economics, the sense among participants that what the markets create is an economic response, not necessarily environmental response. So the realization that the markets generate revenue and resources, but not necessarily that they actually reduce emissions. And related to that, this idea of the inability to price the intangible. At the time, there was a principle of additionality within offsetting particularly, but this applies as well to the generation of credits. So the sense that whatever you create has to have both financial additionality. The projects aren't approved unless you demonstrate the resources generated from the offsets are sufficient to finance the project. And everyone made these arguments in registering their projects, but then often argued that it's not viable. You're not going to build a $2 million project if the thing that the linchpin is the whatever several $100,000 you're going to get out of the emissions credits. And then similarly for the environmental additionality, the same sense that what you're trying to demonstrate is an alternate reality. So if I'm registering, let's say, a clean development mechanism project in China, and I'm a thermal power producer in Germany, I'm making the argument that if I go and I build my wind farm in China because it's cheaper to do that, and I build maybe 80 megawatt capacity, I'm reducing 200,000 tons of emissions every year, because if I didn't build that plant, China would build a thermal plant to stand in for it, to meet the energy demand. And so the challenge with additionality is we don't actually know, does China build that thermal plant anyway? Does it actually have an impact? And so that's sort of one of the challenges around inability to price the intangible. So what I did with this is because I had sufficient responses, I coded these and then I ran statistical analyses. This was just a basic correlate regression analysis to look at the differences across regions, and notice that there are actually some interesting differences on the whole. So like the 33% would suggest in Australia for governance efficiency that Australians are 33% more likely to list governance efficiency as an advantage of emissions trading or of carbon markets than their counterparts within the population or within the study. And then similarly, so if you look across these, there's actually more of a positive perspective, more of a relation of the positive aspects of markets in the Western context and more of a negative connotation, more likely association with the disadvantages in the Asian context, which for me was a real interest in saying, how does the different political, economic, and cultural facets of these countries shape their response to greenhouse gas emissions? And then where does that lead us moving forward? And then finally, also the sense that there is a real association with the negative aspects of pricing, the prevalence of economics and the inability to price the intangible across the countries. All right, so within this idea, then it kind of pushes back on and actually before I go into this, I see some questions on the chat. So let me just check those. Great. Oh, okay. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, they're all from me.
Okay.
So just there, kind of a little bit clarification, I guess, in some ways. You mentioned that there's like a $40 per ton kind of price that I think you said was ecologically relevant. And that's
Yeah.
sort of a figure. Where did that come from? Or maybe you're going to explain that. How do we know that it's $40 a ton, and why would that be a universal or kind of global price?
Yeah, no, I think it's the figure that most economists or ecological economists use, and I think it's based around the way in which social cost is modeled. So there are all of these different assumptions and models about what is the actual price, what is the social cost of carbon. And so I think this has just been established through a series of publications and different models as kind of the base. Beyond $40, or if you have a lot lower than $40 per price, $40 per ton price, you're not actually going to have an environmental or ecological impact with the carbon tax. And that's probably those studies are maybe a decade old at this point. So it's fair to say, Jordan, I haven't looked at this literature in a while. It's probably fair to go back and see if they've price inflated or if they've established a new ecologically relevant price. But absolutely, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Right,
The other two are maybe better suited to the end, kind of about the overall narrative about the idea of a carbon market and how that's perceived, particularly in maybe in the U.S. or Western context among more conservative elements of government, where one group may call it a carbon price or something, others would describe it as a carbon tax, and it's seen as a penalty. Maybe those other two questions are kind of bigger picture things we can come back to at the end, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, it's definitely the tax versus price is definitely a nuance of the Western and maybe less Europe as well. When the International Framework on Climate Change was established, the European Union was actually arguing for a tax because they addressed their acid rain problem with the taxing mechanism. The United States, very free market, wanted a market mechanism. That's also how we addressed acid rain. That was one of the first trials of the coast theory. And of course, the US won, being the great power at the end of the Cold War. And this is, when I teach about this in class, I also make the point that climate change, the Framework Convention in 1992 is a post-Cold War development policy. This was actually, now that the Cold War is over, the West is victorious, what do we do about our development agenda? And so climate change was very much situated in that framework, which is also kind of when you look at the timing of what was happening. And so for the US, for Australia, whether it's a tax or a price or a dividend, is very significant, and it signals very different, the sort of polarized political dynamic within each jurisdiction. For the Asian context, it actually makes very little difference. It's sort of seen as, it's more from an engineering standpoint, this is a technical device. Yeah. This is how it operates, and you're controlling either price or quantity. The biggest source of resistance to the idea was actually in the Japanese case, which was really fascinating, the sense that, that money needs to have a material connotation, like it needs to be doing something positive for the environment. There actually needs to be a physical transformation, and the sense of materiality actually also being related to what an industry does. So, I got examples like Toshiba can't just plant trees, because trees have nothing to do with their productive industry. They have to find some way to transform the manufacturing process of the automobile itself, or they're not actually having a material impact. And this pushback against, there was a term that was coined in Japan at the time called the money game. They use katakana and called it money game, really clever, that trading was just a money game. And they had very innovative other ideas about how to better transform the productive process for different outcomes. So that if you read the book, the Japanese case kind of unpacks those layers of complexity within the culture and political economy.
Wow. So the terminology matters.
The terminology matters. Yeah. It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So coming on to this idea, like what does this mean beyond pricing greenhouse gas emissions? I picked up this article a couple of years ago from Paul Krugman, Getting Real About Rural America. And this was right before the 2020 election. The sense of despair that there was a deep rural or urban-rural divide. I think there still is, and that rural America was in decline. The heartland is in decline. Nobody knows how to fix it. There are powerful forces behind the relative, and in some cases, absolute decline of rural America. And nobody knows how to reverse those forces. And so to some extent, I think also this is where the Biden administration's focus on a major, what was first initially, as you all know, an infrastructure bill that had not just the physical infrastructure, but the social, the cultural infrastructure as a way to revitalize the country. I think that's where some of this impetus came from, was this idea of how do we heal the heartland, the rural heartland divide? How do we help America that's hurting? And, as we've seen, that political process, that political reality is very challenging. So now we have the infrastructure bill, which has gone back to the bipartisan, just physical infrastructure. We're all willing to agree that we need that, and that's a good way to boost the economy. And the separate piece of it, the build back better, the social, the cultural, still to be determined if that will pass. But I think it's actually related to these understandings of what the economy does and how we manage economic problems. And so this is sort of at the bottom tracing three ideas about economic sustainability. The first is what became very popular in the 90s, the triple bottom line, this idea that you have in all considerations, economic considerations, environmental considerations, society considerations, and those are three realms that you find sustainability where you balance them, and there's something in the middle. And as that process of business practice evolved, as that process of different economic policies evolved, there's sort of, again, out of the ecological economics, this argument that there's two different forms of sustainability. One is weak sustainability, and reconceptualizing this idea of the three circles is instead, if you're trying to balance and treating those as co-equal, you're never going to actually achieve. You're always going to be making trade-offs. You're never going to actually achieve sustainability. It's going to be weak at best. And then situated within that, or in contrast to that, are these concentric circles where you nest the economic productivity within social productivity. Your economy, your industries must be supported first by vibrant, healthy social systems, and the social structures must be nested within the environmental system. So they must sit within what the environment is capable of producing, what the environment is capable of withstanding, and the environment dictates what happens in the social, and the social dictates what happens in the economic. And so this argument that that's a form of strong sustainability. So what I've done in my work, one of the things that I did in analyzing the greenhouse gas emissions markets and the creation of externalities pricing was trace the economic theory through various economic time periods, and then back to its original roots and this idea of there's two kinds of value, use and exchange. And noticing that most economics, whether it's heterodox or orthodox, theorized exchange value. If you think about the Marshallian Revolution and the way we teach economics today, the kind of core principle is this relationship of price and quantity and everything. There's kind of the supply and demand, and you can reuse that basic relationship to reinterpret all kinds of economic factors and forces. That's a theory of exchange. Similarly, in heterodox, all of the theories drawing from like Ricardo or from Marx are theories of exchange. They're focusing on the labor relations within the exchange dynamic, but theorizing exchange. And so I trace that actually back to Aristotle's Politics, where he made the first distinction. And Aristotle has this really interesting argument saying, there are two different forms of value, but one is he called it natural. And again, that's a translation, but one is a natural form of value. One is an objective, which is the use. Use is the natural form. Exchange is not natural. And the worst connotation of exchange is usury, this idea that you generate interest off of the creation of exchange value. So I took that idea and this kind of hesitance in the original foundation around exchange and said, well, that's both of those formulations are missing something, which is the temporal dynamic. Where, when, and how does value exist across space and time? And made the argument that if you add time to the equation, you have not two forms of value, you have at least four. Right, where you take the what has been realized to the present, and here present is the left column, but really it's probably just this line, the ever evolving line in the middle, right? Everything that is past coming and moving into the future, and then you have future potential value, everything yet to be created. And if we do that, we add to exchange, which is a socio-economic spatial connotation, and use, which is a socio-environmental connotation, two additional categories: derived value, the potential of exchange, and external value, the potential of use, right? And as you know, within the financial system, especially since the deregulation of the 70s, we've had all kinds of connotation and experimentation with derived value. I mean, I would argue this is where derivative finance exists. What we're trying to create with the emissions markets is a form of external value, pricing the externalities. The challenge, though, is fundamentally pricing is a theory of exchange. We've never really developed the theories of use. How do you sustain use across times? And so the very principles upon which we're establishing externalities pricing are flawed, because it's not about pricing or exchanging the value. This is something that I've seen in my work on emissions markets, how quickly the emissions markets start to mirror the financial service industry, because they're adapted by the financial service industry. So as early as 2006, 2007, before there's even a regulated federal market in the United States, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers are developing these really creative financial derivatives for emissions trading, such as the carbon default swap, the carbon tranche credit. And they're the same kind of financial instruments that were implicated in the 2008 financial crisis. Deep extensions of the temporal connotation of value represented as commensurate through exchange in the present. So I argue that if we don't consider the temporal dynamic, there's a huge complexity, a missed dynamic in understanding the way in which financial services, external values, bring or represent the connotation of value in productive economies today. And then if you add to that this idea of sustainability, again, like if you were to map that over where your concentric circles, I think where you get the closest to this idea of strong sustainability is the external value, is in generating economies that produce long-term sustained external value across a range of sectors and across time. And so I know this is very theoretical and abstract, but I'm gonna work through two short case study examples to kind of try to demonstrate the principle. And maybe before I do that, I'll just take more questions. Controversial question alert. In the context to achieve goal. Yeah.
Yeah, that was me too. I thought it needed a disclaimer depending on who's in the audience and what their thoughts are on climate change. But you know, is it worth it to talk about the idea of a carbon market to address climate change, or like you mentioned in the past, instances where market mechanisms were successfully used to address an environmental problem, but it was really narrowly focused on like one type of pollution, CFCs or nitrous oxides or something like that. It was so narrowly focused that the kind of broader environmental context, it was okay to leave them out, and maybe more people were able to get on board? Or is there some value, do you think, in actually talking about a market for carbon, a market that addresses climate change? Does that make sense as a question? Like, should we even talk about climate change if we want to see these things implemented, or does that unnecessarily complicate at times?
It treats the symptoms. So
Sure.
absolutely, in a very inefficient way. Like if we could just, in a realistic but very inefficient way, it treats the symptoms. And this is in my work. I argue climate change is symptomatic of a much broader problem of the function of economies and their spatial disentrainment from the productivity of the natural world. It's just symptomatic. So,
Yeah.
and I make this argument, if we transitioned energy resources overnight, like just eliminated greenhouse gas emissions overnight, and this would be incredibly profitable to the companies that captured that transformation. Like if the energy industry would just take the lead and say, we're doing this, it would be incredibly profitable for them, but it would just unhinder economic growth. We would see rates of growth, like just incredible exponential increases in productivity and growth. And we would destroy the natural environment all faster. You know what I mean? Like we would just, because we wouldn't be treating the underlying cultures and assumptions. And that's, I
Sure.
think, the biggest problem. That's what's causing climate change beyond just like, yes, it's the greenhouse gas emissions, but it's something much more deeper and fundamental than that.
Sure.
So good question. Yeah. So I'm not anti-market. I know,
Right. Well, we figured you weren't. Yeah.
yeah, no, like I'm not anti-market. I think it will eventually cause an energy transformation. Like I think the energy
Sure.
transformation is coming regardless. So the way I like tend to shift this is then into adaptation. I think there's
Mm.
some really interesting challenges and opportunities that arise out of adaptation. But great question. Let's keep going with that thread. And I just want to work this through the two examples. So I think within the United States, you can look at Southern Louisiana and some of the most resource rich and outcome poor states within the United States to really look at how this logic of extractive economies built on highly leveraged exchange value, built on extractive derivative finance, the outcomes that they generate. And so this is, within the literature, within economics and political science, very well demonstrated through the resource curse or paradox plenty that attenuates petroleum and other mineral resource rich countries. So, countries with an abundance of natural resources, usually fossil fuels, minerals, tend to have less economic growth, less democracy, and worse development outcomes than countries with fewer natural resources. And the argument that I make around this is that capital that is not created and embedded in place cannot foster a sustainable economy, especially if economies only privilege or tend to privilege derivative finance. Capital is the means through which resources create value in conjunction with social environmental systems in space and time. And so resource curse occurs particularly with highly liquid assets that are tradable, that are useful anywhere, right? Extracted from particular locations, but put to use anywhere. And the Gulf of Mexico, I think, is a terrific example of this. If we just looked at sort of, if we measured productivity or resources based on, the natural physical resources themselves, this is an incredibly rich riparian environment for the fisheries, for historically at the mouth of the Mississippi Delta, the nutrients, the fisheries, the plant, the forest that would have been in this region. And if you think about why petroleum and other carbon-based resources are here, it's because of all of that productivity over millennia has embedded, the embedded fossil fuel. So in the 1920s, oil emerged on the back of other extractive industries, timber, furs, rice, salt, and wetland leases allowed companies to build massive networks of canals, roads, platforms, and wells. A real rentier economy is sort of, here are the rich resources. This area is populated by people who have fled persecution for a variety of reasons from different cultures. A lot of native tribes have moved into this region. So it doesn't have the same sort of protection of rights that other places around the country have, and incredible resources to extract. This map is actually showing all of those dots are oil or gas wells in the state. All of the pipelines are all of the things that are connecting, all of the infrastructure connecting to offshore resources. I mean, literally every inch of this state, certainly at least every mile of this state, is covered in extractive capacity. And the Gulf has a third of crude oil. It produces a third of crude oil and 40% of its refining capacity. So if the resources in some way produced wealth that was embedded, this should absolutely, through the 1900s into the 21st century, be one of the wealthiest states in the United States. 33,000 miles of pipeline generating $70 billion in annual revenue. The majority of the capital, though, is extracted and abstracted from its source of origin and used in other ways. So the consequences for Louisiana, you have major incidents like the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill. 5 million barrels affecting 35% of the coast were spilled. And then that pollutes all of the fisheries, the water courses. There's long-term health implications. By 1970, oil was producing 40% of the state revenues, yet Louisiana is at the bottom of human development indices. Between 1937 and 1977, that's 20,000 wells drilled, refineries, and that's what these photos on the right are showing. These are people's backyards, and then they're situated in an area, a petrochemical complex called Cancer Alley, because as you can imagine, the rates of cancer around this infrastructure so much higher than the national average. So it's an ecological catastrophe also of subsidence and divergence of sediment. I'll show a report in a second that shows what's going to happen in the next 2 decades to the Louisiana and the Gulf coastline. But the other thing is as they're extracting all of these resources, the land is subsiding, and then to create stable transport and stable, predictable water course flows, they've diverged most of the sediment out of the Mississippi Valley so that the marsh, the ecosystem, isn't replenishing itself. So the consequences for southern Louisiana, 28,000 homes will have to be moved or bought out by 2050. This hurricane season after Hurricane Ida really saw the impact of that. And I don't think the media covered it because fortunately New Orleans fared better, but hundreds of communities were literally destroyed by that impact. They're still waiting for federal aid. They're still waiting for the resources they need to rebuild. And the causes of this, again, the Mississippi River levees that divert sediment so that the basin doesn't replenish itself, all of the canals that have been cut. This is a really delicate combination of seawater marsh, freshwater marsh, and then the kind of riparian environment. And as the canals are cut for dredging, it breaks down those sort of natural barriers and slowly kills the marsh. And then, also the indirect climate change, sea level is rising as well. And unfortunately, accelerating the range and rate of storms impacting this region and happening faster than originally predicted. So this shows actually a really, a kind of nice aerial representation of what this looks like for the ecosystem. This is, if you kind of split the boundary of the Mississippi River Delta, that's, it's not a straight water course. It shouldn't look like this. But of course, with the levees, it is a straight water course. And to the left, the Atchafalaya River Basin, which is still allowing sedimentation. And the Mississippi River Basin, you can see the difference, the real difference in this marsh forest land. It's just completely eroding out of the Louisiana coast. So the other piece of this, I talked about adaptation. I think the other piece of this that's really important is deepening the temporal frame of reference. One of the things that the preference of exchange or derivative value does is it creates the sense that all value can be brought simultaneously into the presence. It loses the connotation of what it means to generate long-term resources. And so you kind of, in planning terms, you move from this idea of contracts or projects of the physical environment that are generating revenue within a 12-month or a best 5-year project. How do you start to think about pushing the boundaries into different temporal frames, the industrial, the intergenerational, the embedded, thinking about the time frame of people's lives, the civilizational, and eventually the ecological. And I argue that as you do that and you think about adaptation planning in response to the deep kind of impacts we're going to face, you also push with that the conceptions of community and resilience, community from this idea of aggregate individuals living in a population into deeper meanings of identity, of cultural, of socio-ecological interdependence. Similarly, adaptation responses transformed from thinking about critical infrastructure in relation to a static natural environment to seeing instead social infrastructural, cultural institutions, relational infrastructure, and eventually integrated human, natural, socio-environmental integrated functionality, right? That's how we need to be thinking about climate change long-term. I don't think I have it in this graphic, but one of my colleagues that I teach with, a really brilliant atmospheric chemist and scientist, Susan Solomon, has done a really wonderful paper with colleagues in her discipline across the country, modeling the long-term impacts of climate change. First, they looked at a 1,000-year impacts, and then they looked at a 10,000-year time frame and demonstrated that regardless of what we do, and sorry, that's not the right way to phrase it, not regardless, what we do now matters. But irrespective of what we do, we will be living with the long-term connotation for thousands of years. If we stopped greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, we would still need to adapt unless we have some kind of major technological infrastructure change that can capture carbon from the atmosphere. I know there's different experiments to try that. Eventually it might be a reality. It's not a reality right now. We are going to be dealing with rising temperatures. We are going to be dealing with sea level rise. It's a difference of whether we're dealing with a 2°C reality or a 6° Celsius reality. So our actions do matter, but we still need to think about adaptation long term. And I think this is actually where we have the opportunity for radical transformation to think about the underlying conditions and make changes in a way that's going to be required just because of what's going to happen with the natural environment. All right, how are we on time, Jordan? Do we have time to quickly work through the Norwegian case experience?
Yeah, so it's 10 till 12. Like I said, the 12:15 is the deadline. We want to have some time for questions. So if you want to take us through the case study, that would be cool too.
Yeah, I think this is a really nice example because it's one of the few resource-rich countries where you don't have the paradox of plenty. It's one of they've learned how to capture their long-term resources. So they've built now their government pension fund that's built off of their petroleum economy is worth more than $1 trillion now. And it's governed both from a financial side and economic side by Norges Bank Investment Management with really strict core principles. I'll talk about a few of them, and then a council on ethics. Interestingly, a few years ago, the fund itself divested. It's great. It's so ironic, divested from fossil fuels for ethical. It's built out of a petroleum economy, but divested from fossil fuels. And then it's built on a dual economy. So it has petroleum core products and petroleum industry supplies to maintain that connection with the physically productive economy. So it privileges employment, workplaces, highly skilled industries in addition to petroleum services. It's also, someone would argue, built on sustainable green domestic industries. So it attenuates and it supports through the revenue generated fisheries, forestry, renewable energy. And it's a way to sort of think about diverting some of the resources generated from petroleum sales and petroleum exports into other services and other sectors of the economy. And then in terms of how it's managed, it really thinks carefully about slowing and localizing as well as diversifying petroleum value. The fund is invested outside of Norway to protect exports. It's also has an annual withdrawal of 4% to avoid hyperinflation. Some argue that the government industry cooperation, again, this is a kind of, social capitalist system, it's cultural and historical, and so much of the experience, both for the technologies of offshore petroleum production, but then also for the management of sociopolitical relationships, come out of fisheries. 90% of Norway's stocks share borders with neighbors, so they argue they have really good experience building the kind of government industry diplomacy in working in complex sectors. And then it's also, the other industries like forestry, they've learned how to diversify the supply chain so that they're generating not just one highly resourced short-term point of value, but they're developing multiple sources of value out of a single resource. So they have wood, cellulose, lignosulfonates, vanillin, and ethanol, as well as bioenergy out of their sustainable forestry resources, not just timber. It's also, their policies are built on the evidence of sustainability of the ecosystem as a whole. So they have a very strong scientific approach. And then finally, I would just add to this, maybe it's at best weak sustainability for Norway. I think it's a fantastic example because they've done such a good job managing petroleum resources, but it's to some extent, they're just offshoring, they're just exporting impacts to all of the countries to which they're actually selling petroleum. So Iceland, which has developed an almost entirely renewable energy economy, might be a better example, and there's some neighbors. Norway could really improve its own prospects by taking an example of what comes after petroleum. All right, so economic pathways to sustainability. In conclusion, I think sustainability, it's not systematic, but it's important to realize it's not about quantity, it's about the way in which we generate value and how is that value nested across different domains in different time frames. And then finally, the spatial and temporal connections to a host of indicators of social and environmental well-being must be considered to actually generate positive financial outcomes. There's also a long-term time horizon that must situate local benefits, that capital embedded in place, as well as global outcomes. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Any questions?
That was really great. Thank you so much. We can all send you a clapping hand emoji in 2021. That's what we do, I guess. So yeah, lots of stuff, lots to think about and talk about there. We had an interesting question from my colleague, Dr. Ted Howell. Ted, do you want to just ask directly instead of me reading it?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much, Janelle, for that. I asked this question before, but I was really fascinated by the theoretical stuff about value, right? And how it's calculated and what that means. So I think, but one thing that would be helpful for me, you had mentioned that you had done a lot of work about tracking emissions markets. And one thing that, as someone who doesn't come from economics, I'm in the humanities, and I was just reading in the past couple of months about how badly a lot of countries are misreporting their emissions data, and how that is really throwing a wrench into the promises and the goals that countries are making. A lot of this came out, as COP was wrapping up in Scotland. So I'm curious about if you see like an erosion of trust in that emissions data, and if there, are good reasons for that erosion of trust, like how that affects the capacity of markets to do this type of mitigation?
Yeah, a great question, Ted. Thank you for that. I think that's spot on. And in some places it's, it can be chalked up to incompetence. These are that idea of technical complexity. These are the integrity of carbon accounting is actually a very complicated thing to achieve. And then, towards the point of corruption, there are all sorts of ways in which, because you're dealing with such an abstract idea, the absence of emissions, or ways in which you can, if the auction or if the allocation of credits depends on historic energy use, there's ways to inflate your energy use or even your energy needs so that you get a bigger share of the auction. And I think this is where the European experience is really instructional, and there's some good kind of base principles that come out of the European experience, because they went through several price crashes when they realized they'd over allocated credits, and their price went, this was in 2007 or so, their price went from 30 euro per ton to 50 euro cents per ton, and then they had to go back and try to renegotiate between the commission and the member states to pull back or reclaim some of those over allocated credits in the next phase of the system. So I think there's some really good principles, like having an apolitical centralized authority that manages the accounting and the operation of the registry, and this is something where, again, in the EU, it should be the European Commission. That's their sort of technical authority. But as a political compromise, they shared power with the member states. And then when they do that, they necessarily come into the political influence of different industry lobbies, right? But I think in the absence of that, a lot of countries have taken that example and said the first thing you build is the central authority that manages the credits, both their accounting, the mechanisms, and then also their distribution. And that's a really good principle. And then the other piece is having these sort of phased operations so that you kind of know the system's going to fail and you restart it every few years. It's a built-in assumption, is another really good principle. It does, I think it simultaneously erodes trust, but it also, in some ways, it's really positive, because if it's not too stringent to begin with the system, it's a way to get people engaged, and it becomes the kind of habit and proxy. I'm a big fan of Lohman's scholarship of manage what you measure, that even if you're misrepresenting in public, just the process of measuring and thinking about your greenhouse gas emissions is a way to get industry thinking about where do they have inefficiencies, and if they have carbon inefficiencies, those are energy inefficiencies. So if they tackle those, they can actually save money. So I do think there's some soft power in it. There's some sort of inertia and some practice that's actually really useful.
Oh my God, my head is about to explode because I love this topic so much. Just thinking about all these different ideas. Janelle, one question that I had, and please correct me if I'm misquoting something that you said. I think you said, or kind of suggested, that highly mobile capital frequently leads to worse environmental outcomes, which is a very interesting idea, because what about this, evidence that globalization of finance should lead folks to chase the highest return, quote unquote, anywhere. And so if environmental projects or sustainability projects happen to be the ones, promising the highest return, shouldn't global capital kind of flow to those and achieve the environmental outcomes that we're looking for? Or is that kind of a limited understanding?
No, I think you're right. I think what's missing is the time frame. Like, there is this idea with derivative finance that you can accrue instantaneously the value of something yet to occur.
Sure.
Like it's an unrealized promise of future value that tends to generate, I think, the most circulation of capital from these sources of liquid transaction, like petroleum extraction, into derivative markets. And that means very little of that value is actually staying in place. It's major producers that have headquarters somewhere else that are extracting the resource and very quickly transforming it or cycling it through other markets, moving it into other domains. So I think, and what's interesting, there's a longer write-up, and I can send the article on this, looking not just at the physical mobility, the liquidity of like the physical commodity, but its financial ramification. I think this trend, and I sort of demonstrate this in the article, accelerated in the 70s as finance is decoupled from the physical productive economy. And you absolutely see this within the energy markets. So I think it's one of those ways it's complex. So to your point about where is the highest and best use, maybe is another way to think about it. If value has no temporal connotation and derived value is the same as every other form of value, you're always going to end up with derivative value, because as you take advantage of the sort of exponential leveraging potential of derivative value, that's always going to have a greater connotation, a sort of higher monetary value than anything else. If value actually has temporal connotation, that's where you start to get into the realized advantages of environmental value, right? Where you have to think about what is produced over time, what is the temporal signature of something's use or of something's vitality. And that's a kind of economic system we don't have. I sometimes, to illustrate this, I go back and I work through the 2008 financial crisis, and I say, one way to understand this is through the distortion of value from its spatial and temporal exaggeration, or its spatial and temporal disconnect. So in my graphic, there's two rows of, or two columns rather, of value. But if you think about it, it's sort of, you can make unlimited categories of value moving into the future, right? Unlimited potential. And to some extent, when you start leveraging, I'm holding maybe 10% of the capital, and I'm leveraging 90% of the capital based on what I think that capital is going to generate in the future. That's absolutely what you're doing. And so I sort of work through the mortgage, toxic mortgage stream with this model. And I say, what is the mortgage? What is its physical value? It's both the fact that you have a building somewhere, a house somewhere that is generating, utility for someone. And then it's tied to the mortgage is this idea that you have traditionally a young couple can't afford to buy the house, but they want to make use of it over the course of their lifetimes, raise their family, et cetera. And so they go to the bank has the capital, and the bank says, I'll do you a favor. This is finance as a service. I'll lend you the capital now. And over 30 years, your surplus productivity will repay the value of this loan and also repay the interest. So it's beneficial to both of us, but that's a slow long-term return on the investment. And that couple, the physicality or the temporal physicality of it, the materiality of it, is the fact that they are going to work for 30 years. They're going to have a livelihood. They're going to have jobs. They're going to generate revenue for 30 years to repay the value of the mortgage. So what the financial service industry starts to do, and again, this is after the deregulation in the 70s, is to create derivative products. So we take all of the mortgages, we make an assumption, 90% are going to repay, 10% are going to default. We have a slight discount of the value, and then we sell it on as the mortgage-backed security. So now we've actually sold the mortgage twice. Once to all of those couples, now as an investment product. Here's the first derivative to all of these financial industry services and this is so lucrative, and it starts to create a real estate cycle. And then there's, 2 or 3 other layers of derivatives, the credit default swap. And so by the time you get to 2007, where you're looking at like tertiary derivatives on the same resource streams, the estimated value, I think in 2007 in the US of the credit default swaps, which is like a secondary derivative at this point, is something like $62 trillion. It's more than twice the productive economy. And you can mathematically model how do you get to that kind of value. But in effect, you're basically, there's no consideration of time, that idea that 30 years of productivity to generate the first layer of value. And then, none of that is encoded or encapsulated in the models. And so that's where you get this kind of incredible distortion without considering the temporal connotation of value.
Yeah, I wonder, as an avowed lover of financial engineering, frankly, controversially in the world of environmental studies, I wonder what's your take on the idea of derivatives as being a risk management tool? I mean, there's the kind of profiteering, element to them, and this abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction that's very interesting. But from the other side of the coin, derivatives, you can say it's risk management. I'm distributing the risk, perhaps unfairly, but distributing the risk of people not paying across a broader pool of investors. Is there something instructive there when thinking about, as huge a risk as climate change, that if we have derivatives associated with climate change, that we're just finding a larger pool of investors to distribute that risk across? Or is there something different about climate change where that kind of risk management thinking about derivatives no longer applies?
No, and again, I'm not anti-finance. I'm not
Right,
saying,
right, 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 right.
I just think that without regulation, that's the danger. There's two things. One is so allowing leverage ratios of 30-1, for example,
Sure.
is incredibly problematic. You're never gonna, I don't think you ever have a positive outcome in that kind of scenario.
Sure.
The other is this mistaken assumption that all forms of value are commensurate through exchange, that that there is utility in creating a kind of credit default swap that allows eventually, like the credit default swap was an insurance product, but basically though unregulated. So
Yeah.
Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac might have this credit default swap to guarantee the investment of the mortgage stream. But what they were allowing, Goldman Sachs was selling the credit default
Yeah.
swaps to the owners of the tranche
Right.
products themselves. And so it's basically like you have insurance to hedge against your own default. And then they were also selling those products to any interested party. So
Right.
you could have a credit default swap on somebody else's. It's basically like, my 10 neighbors having insurance on my home burning down.
Yeah.
Then everybody has an interest in my home burning down. And then the insurance company realistically is never going to be able to repay everyone when my home burns down. So I do think I'm with you, Jordan. I think that there is utility, even for the environmental space, in the capacity to leverage future value. And to some extent, that's all finance is, to leverage potential value, but it needs to be fully understood. The temporal connotation of it, I think, needs to be earmarked. And then it also needs to be very carefully regulated, which is right now what we don't have.
Yeah. I mean, you get into this weird philosophical thing of what is the discounted value of wilderness 600 years in the future. Well, it's priceless now. So what is the discounted value of priceless? You can't do the same type of calculation as you would on a structure. I know we're running short on time. Can I ask Dr. Reeves any final thoughts, questions, comments you have for our speaker before we set her loose on the rest of her day?
Sure. Thanks for coming today. Just in terms of the students who are present today, this can get kind of overwhelming when we think of what needs to be done. So is there any advice you would give to our students that on an individual level, what they can do in terms of climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Just like your comments on that. Also, in terms of your response to what happened in Glasgow as well. I know that's a lot.
Yeah. On the student front, I mean, I do think there is a lot, and the millennial generation is really good about operating through social media and operating kind of in a way disconnected from the nation state. I know we're never fully disconnected, but they are their own constituency. They set their own rules and boundaries. So there's a lot of really creative apps and techniques to use your consumer purchases, for example, to offset carbon, or even just to count your carbon and then kind of make smart production decisions based on what you buy. So there's sort of ways in which your own consumer decisions can make that kind of an impact. I think voting is also another really important thing that we can all do, is that there is still a political need or a political requirement to have good policies. And so not just voting at a federal level, but voting in your local and state elections is really important. Thinking about what your municipality, what kind of policies are coming out, how do you push positive change? And then, also in the work that you're doing, I don't know where most people in this class are going to end up working, but I think the sort of ideas about how do you have a sustainable industry, or how do you have a sustainable impact I think it's important for people to be able to carry those into their own lives and their own work. And sort of, it doesn't have to be a big global, a big global investment or a big global intervention to make a difference. So if wherever you end up working, whatever you end up doing, if you can think about, how do I help my company? How do I help the place where I'm working generate more socially viable long-term capital? I think that can be really positive. And what are the transformations I can make? And then what happened in Glasgow, I think what's really interesting and what was most worrying is it was a real opportunity with the Biden administration, again, fully on board and coming to the table. The absence of China and India, I think that's what's most worrying, because and I don't fully understand the broader geopolitics around that, why, if that was that specific to other international relations policies, or was it a transformation within those societies and how they view this kind of climate mitigation momentum? I don't know, but I think that the lack of a strong footprint from those countries was really worrying, because these powerful emerging economies are so essential to a global agreement, to positive transformation, and most likely the momentum of the Biden administration will not last. We will swing back the other direction. We'll have, and then again, the United States is a necessary player, but we can't, to some extent, we need other countries like China and India to do this more.
Wow. All right. That's so much to think about. And thank you so much. We're all looking forward to seeing what research you come up with next to help us understand the complexity of all of these topics. Thank you so much again for joining us this morning, I guess into afternoon, and taking time out of your day. Just a reminder to everyone, we'll be posting a recording of Dr. Knox-Hayes' talk to the Rowan Center for Responsible Leadership YouTube channel in the coming days. So thank you once again, Janelle Knox-Hayes.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and happy upcoming holidays.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.